who has written the book on driving around Illinois in your car, and you can get out. It's optional. Tex Banish, his real name is Stan. Is that short for Stash?
Stash?
Yeah.
Okay. Some of my Polish friends call me Stash.
Yeah.
Not too many.
And he's published this absolutely marvelous book, and you gotta buy it, folks. Welcome, Tex Banish.
Thanks, John. Okay. Everybody hear me back there in the back? Good, good. That's off to a good start. Okay, let me see if this thing's working here. Okay, I want to thank the North Shore Senior Center for inviting me to talk about the history of the great state of Illinois as described in my book, Roadside History of Illinois. A book of discovery that seeks to enlighten residents about our history, which is seldom discussed except at meetings of historical societies, occasionally in classrooms, and at history fairs. For many young people, it is as if Illinois somehow surfaced one day without a past and consists only of Abraham Lincoln. And I know I have a short amount of time here, about 45 minutes to talk, so I've prepared text. I'm going to go right through it. And you just kind of watch the slides and listen to the text. Well, this book supports the slogan that just outside Chicago and Springfield, there's a place called Illinois. And it has a wondrous story that extends from the Ice Age to the present. A story presented in this book through carefully selected and thoroughly researched stories identified in conjunction with roadways where history happened. Robert Ballard, the undersea explorer and discoverer of the Titanic in the Atlantic, said, "To make the best of our future as a people, we must understand our past." That is so true, and I'm here to introduce you to our past. Geographically, Illinois is about 210 to 275 miles wide, depending on your location, and 400 miles long. The book offers a total of 69 separate trips, road trips, most of which range from 50 to 100 miles each that follow primarily U.S. and state highways and occasional county roads. In the process, motorists can explore the 7 regions of the state, visit about 250 of the state's approximately 1,300 cities, towns, and villages, and be introduced to the people, places, and events that contributed to the state's historic development. As a result, you will be able to see it, visualize it, and feel the spirit of our early settlers. The cover here, seen here, depicts a mural transforming the prairie, completed by Bloomington artist Ken Holder, and depicts the Illinois landscape as it might have looked in the 1870s, with the growing seasons, farm machinery, a rural town, the railroad, Lake Michigan, and the Chicago skyline. And you can see all that right up here in the back, the railroad, way up at the top, Lake Michigan, and the Chicago skyline. So it is all there. Ken Holder is still alive, lives in Bloomington, Illinois, is in his 70s. This mural can be seen in the state capitol in Springfield, displayed in the South Hall on the first floor. And here it is. And that's me there on a recent trip to Springfield when I did a downstate book tour. On the screen are some highlights of the book's content, including an acknowledgement to John Swenson, who is seated right here in front. He was one of the 500 people at libraries, historical societies, museums, and with historians who assisted in the process and received a personal thank you letter from me. Illinois was developed after 4 or 6 periods of glacial activity. The latter two, the Illinoisan and Wisconsin glaciers, were most paramount in forming the state's current topography. And here you see the Illinoisan glacier, which extended almost to Carbondale, Illinois, and then the Wisconsin, which was the last one that probably reached to about Springfield. You'll notice the Galena area in the far northwest part up here, way up there at the top, and the southern part here where the Shawnee National Forest is. south of Carbondale at the southern tip of the state. Both remain virtually untouched by glacial activity, and there you will find rolling hills, wetlands, outcroppings of bedrock, and rich forests. The rest of the state was left flat and very nondescript. Many of your grandchildren probably hate to drive through Illinois because of its flatness. It may make for a boring drive on the interstate, but it also produced some of the richest farmland in the country. The ice fields lasted thousands of years, and in both glaciers, the ice ranged from 700 to 1,000 feet high. As a good comparison, think of a wall of ice almost as high as the Willis Tower, formerly the Sears Tower in Chicago. It's almost hard to believe. Sometime after glacial activity ended around 18,000 BC, animals followed by humans crossed the land bridge from Asia to the North American continent and migrated down to what we now know as Illinois, reaching here around 12,000 BC. For nearly the next 14,500 years, the four cultures shown on this image roamed the land. Each culture was progressive and also may have traded and interacted with other cultures over time. But by 14,500 AD, the Mississippian culture disappeared, and there are no definitive answers as to why. Today, the remains of their societies, especially the Mississippian, can be seen in Cahokia Mounds at Collinsville, the Center for American Archaeology site near Campsville, and Dixon Mounds near Lewistown, all in the southern or western regions of the state. Cahokia Mounds, shown here, is a prime example of Mississippian culture. Now, this is a painting done by William Eisminger, who's on the staff at Cahokia Mounds. Here we see a 3,500 acre city, over 100 mounds and about containing 20,000 inhabitants. So it's quite an extensive area. Today, if you go down to Cahokia Mounds, you'll see an interstate passing right across here and another highway right across here, unfortunately. Perhaps some engineers, road engineers, didn't realize that the treasure that they had when they laid out the roads. Monk's Mound in the center, right over here, is about 100 feet high, four-tiered, and contains about 22 million cubic feet of dirt and was used for ceremonial purposes. Other mounds of lesser height were used primarily for burials. Monk's Mound received its name from the French Trappist monks that occupied the area in the early 1800s. They abandoned it in 1813 following an epidemic fever, returned to the East Coast, and then France. But from that point forward, that mound always remained known as Monk's Mound. Monk's Mound became a United Nations World Heritage Site in 1982, putting it on a par with the city of Rome, the Great Wall of China, the Great Pyramids of Egypt, and the Taj Mahal in Agra, India. Before you make a trip abroad to some of these exotic sites, or maybe you have already, now you might want to take a drive down to Monk's Mound in Collinsville, which is a lot closer. Unfortunately, our state tourism department does not promote Monk's Mound in the right manner as a World Heritage Site. Here we have the French explorers. They came about approximately 200 years after the disappearance of the Mississippian culture. There was no contact, so consequently we don't know what happened to the Mississippian culture. But when the French explorers came, you have Pierre Jacques Marquette on the left, Louis Joliet, and René Robert Cavelier Sieur de La Salle on the right. This area here south of here on Hiram Avenue between 47th and 48th Street is known as symbolically Chicago's Plymouth Rock. Before we get to that, let me just talk a little bit about Father Marquette, who on a return trip to Green Bay in 1673 with Louis Joliet portaged from the Des Plaines River to the south branch of the Chicago River through what later became known as Mud Lake, which is now an industrial area. The site of the Chicago portage, also known as Chicago's Plymouth Rock, as I mentioned, is located in the suburb of Lyons. A visit there will enable you to visualize how early explorers and others were able to cross Mud Lake from the Des Plaines River to the West Fork of the South Branch of the Chicago River. And this is what it looks like. It's hard to believe that on the east side of this area, this little kind of an island or oasis, is Harlem Avenue, and the south side is I-55. Over here is the Des Plaines River, and this is just some of the floodplain. And so you can imagine that the explorers probably came somewhere in there and then crossed the floodplain and then across, which is swamp and wetland area. And this exists. You would not believe that it exists in that location, but it does. And you will not hear a plane overhead. You will not hear automobiles. It's almost like being at Disney World in another location. This portage is significant because it later spurred development of Chicago and was a driving force behind regional settlement patterns. Now, Joliet first proposed a canal being built between the Des Plaines and Chicago rivers, the West Fork of the South Branch, which was the closest end to the Des Plaines River at the time. And the distance was half a league, as he described it, which was about 1.5 miles. Certainly feasible, as he wrote. The canal was eventually built 160 years later, but not to the Des Plaines River, but to the Illinois River. Here we see the influence of the French-British in pre-colonial days. The French influence lasted for about 90 years, British influence for about 20, and then the development of the Illinois country. You see how the French held control of their territory with the various forts along the Mississippi River. This is a timeline of the various activities. By 1809, Illinois was its own territory, which included Wisconsin and parts of Michigan and Minnesota, with the capital at Kaskaskia down in southwestern Illinois. On December 3, 1818, Illinois became the 21st state in the Union, and the flag's 21st star was added on the following July 4, which then at that time became a new procedure that took place then and continues to this day. When a new state is added, as Hawaii or Alaska were the last, the star was added on the succeeding July 4th. All this was being done in Alaska, the territorial and later state capital in the southwestern part of Illinois. At the time, only a frontier fort existed at the future site of Chicago. Here we have two people from southwestern Illinois had the greatest impact on the northern part of the state. One is Nathaniel Pope, here on the left, and Daniel Pope Cook on the right. Pope petitioned Congress as Illinois territorial delegate in 1818 to move the state's northern boundary from the southern tip of Lake Michigan, as outlined in the Northwest Ordinance, about 60 miles north to its present location, adding 14 additional counties. He argued that Illinois, without an outlet to the lake, could have a negative impact on national security. Unknown to him at that time, of course, he also spared us from becoming cheeseheads and rooting for the Green Bay Packers, because all of us in this locality would have been in Wisconsin. Cook, the second congressman from Illinois, succeeded after several attempts in having Congress approve the sale of thousands of acres on either side of a proposed canal route, with the proceeds used to fund the canal's construction. It was this canal, the Illinois and Michigan Canal, with construction beginning in 1836 and ending in 1848, which contributed so greatly to the development and growth of Chicago. Cook never saw the canal completed or its impact on the city's development. He was a sickly individual. He died in 1827 as a young man, and our esteemed political leaders thought so highly of Daniel Pope Cook that they named the county for him. Yes, Illinois had slavery, Indian massacres, agricultural innovations, banditry, pirates, some prominent leaders, and a whole lot more. What many of us forget, especially in Chicago, is that Illinois was once part of the frontier, and so was Chicago. The first region we'll talk about southern Illinois, and specifically Illinois 146, which extends here from Golconda across to approximately Ware on the Mississippi River, closely follows the Trail of Tears, which is an approximately 60-mile trek across the state from, as I mentioned, Golconda, Ohio to Ware on the Mississippi, and passing through Vienna and Jonesboro, the site of the third Lincoln-Douglas debate in 1858. The Trail of Tears, as it was later called, is the forced march of the Cherokee from their ancestral homelands in Georgia, North Carolina, and Tennessee to Indian Territory west of the Mississippi River. It began in August 1838 when about 13,000 Cherokee were transported by boats up the Tennessee River to the Ohio River, where they disembarked at Golconda for the trek across Illinois, including through this area here that later became a rural cemetery that contained some Cherokee graves. This rural cemetery is just west of Golconda. An early winter storm caught them on the eastern side of the Mississippi River, unable to cross in boats because of floating ice. Poorly dressed and exposed to the frigid cold, men, women, and children who were unable to find shelter with nearby farmers huddled near campfires to stay warm. By the time they reached Indian Territory in 1839, about 25% of them had died. Here you see an exhibit on the right of a Cherokee camp as depicted in the Trail of Tears State Park in Missouri. You can see the dress is very light, totally unsuitable for winter survival. And there's a wagon in the background. Camp Dubois, this is a recreation of the military fort that was used by Meriwether Lewis and William Clark prior to their departure for the West Coast. This is on the Illinois side of the Mississippi River, and according to Lewis's journals, this is where they started. Now, some Missourians might want you to believe that they started on the Missouri River, but they did not. They started from Illinois. So don't you believe those what the Missourians say. They say, show me, so you show them that it's from Illinois. Okay, Salem 8 and the GI Bill of Rights, down in Salem, Illinois. Those of you who may have benefited from the GI Bill should enjoy this story. How many here from the GI Bill? Use the GI Bill. Oh, a lot of you, okay. Well, this is where it started. Salem, Illinois, downstate. The trip on Illinois 37 takes you to this little town where in 1943, at Luther B. Easley American Legion Post 128, 8 men met and outlined what later became known as the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944. We know it as the GI Bill of Rights. Here's the picture of the 8 men who met, one of whom was a former governor, John Stell, and another was an executive, Alphonse Starshak. This is John Stell here. This is Alphonse Starshak, an executive at Walgreens. And various forms of the GI Bill continue today, so our veterans are still benefiting from that program. This is a picture of the old slave house, the Crenshaw House. Even though the ordinance of 1787 banned slavery in the Northwest Territory, slavery did exist, and the old slave house owned by John Crenshaw existed near the town of Equality. And that is one example. It's kind of interesting that a slave house in the town of Equality. Crenshaw captured free black people, free, mind you, not free ones, along with fugitive slaves. He didn't care who he was capturing and who he was selling to. Keeping some of them in his house on the 3rd floor to work in the nearby salines that he leased from the federal government, he also resold some in the south. So they were kept, he lived down here in the lower quarters and kept the slaves chained in cubicles at night so they could not escape. He lost his lease in 1846. The state constitution abolished slavery in 1848, and he died in 1871. The state of Illinois owns the house. They bought it in the year 2000, and now they're restoring it. I'd be remiss in this year of the 50th anniversary of the Beatles if I didn't mention that Louise Harrison, the sister of George Harrison, lived in Benton, Illinois. which is south of Salem. And in 1963, George Harrison visited his sister, bought a guitar for $500 at a local music shop, and jammed with local groups in or near Benton. Unknown to them, this stand-in would return to the United States the following year as a member of the Beatles. The former bungalow where his sister lived is now called the Hard Day's Night Bed and Breakfast in Benton. The guitar that George Harrison bought in Benton recently sold for $675,000 at auction. Okay, Western Illinois. This region between the Illinois and Mississippi rivers is known as the military tract, whereby 3.5 million acres were set aside to reward veterans of the War of 1812 and to encourage settlement of the area. One of the trips in this region includes the Colony Church, one of the few buildings remaining at Bishop Hill, a Swedish Lutheran church colony, which was one of 3 religious colonies founded in Illinois. The other 2 are the Mormons in Nauvoo and the Amish in Arthur. Eric Jansen and his followers arrived in 1846, purchased 544 acres, built some shelters, storehouses, and a large church, which you see here. By 1861, the loss of their leader, political infighting, and other issues led the colony to collapse. The Colony Church still stands and became a national landmark here in 1984. Reverend Augustine Tolton is associated with Quincy, Illinois on the Mississippi River. He's the first black priest in the United States. He was born a slave in Missouri, taken with his siblings by his mother to Quincy and was schooled there. He began his study for the priesthood in 1880, was ordained in 1886, transferred to Chicago in 1889, and died at age 43 from a heat stroke in 1897 while returning from a retreat on a hot Chicago day. He is buried in Quincy and is now under consideration for sainthood by the Catholic Church. We go to the northern part of the region. We see the Underground Railroad home of Reverend Owen Lovejoy, who is an abolitionist. This is his home in, as it looked, about 1900. It has since been restored and is in much better condition. But he was the brother of Elijah Lovejoy, who you may remember back in Alton, who fought for freedom of the press and gave his life for it. But Owen Lovejoy became a congressman, was a friend of Abraham Lincoln, and witnessed the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation, and that home did harbor fugitive slaves. Central Illinois basically is Lincoln country, because his whole life basically was centered there. But we will not focus on the rail splitter. Most people know the Lincoln story, so I will point out some other interesting sites, including old U.S. Route 66, also known as the Mother Road, which basically comes along in here, now replaced by I-55. U.S. Route 66 was the gateway to the west in the 1930s and 40s, stretching from Michigan Avenue and Jackson in Chicago to Santa Monica, California. Although it has been superseded by I-55, about 85% of the original road remains intact for those of you who may want to venture out and do some research on it. It was originally Illinois 4, down here in southern Illinois, or southern central Illinois. As more people took the cars, the federal government renumbered many highways, and Illinois 4 and other routes, which still exist, were renumbered US 66. Now I-55, which replaced 66, bypasses most towns. One example of a remaining historic site on the highway is this original Sobeys service station in Mount Olive, which is the southern part of the region. It is preserved and converted as a museum and tourist information center. Here you see, in just a little further north of there, Litchfield, Illinois, is the Ariston Cafe. It is no longer on I-55. You have to go off a couple blocks, but It still exists, and it looks the same way it did in the 1935 when it located to that site. There you see a guy there waiting to be waited on in the Ariston Cafe, and I might point out that those are the original booths in there from 1935. Everything in that restaurant. So if you want to recapture the spirit of the US 66 and maybe your youth, go down to the Ariston Cafe, sit in there, have a meal, and just turn back the clock to 1935 or 1940. Here's the Macoupin County Courthouse in Carlinville. Corruption and mismanagement in Illinois is not a new phenomenon. Okay, it goes back a long way. In fact, I might point out that when the state was first, when territorial leaders wanted to establish Illinois as a state, they need a population of 60,000. Now, who knew whether there were 60,000 people in the state? They figured probably there were about 50,000, and they were counting people that were coming in, and they didn't know if they stayed or they just were passing through. So when they applied for statehood, they probably didn't have 60,000 to legally qualify. So maybe even back then, they were playing with numbers and so forth. But here in the Carlinville Courthouse, this small town in Macoupin County is a perfect example of government waste and extravagance. This did not occur today, but in 1870. The original appropriation for this building here was $50,000, 191 feet high, a classic revival courthouse. The cost ballooned to $1.4 million. Now this was in 1870. The building wastefully included marble floors, iron interior doors, ornamental iron stair railings, a 7-foot-high judge's chair hand-carved in walnut, which you can barely see, but here it is, a walnut chair for the judge, a 600-seat courtroom there. How many times have you seen this courtroom filled with 600 people? 40-foot-high Corinthian columns there on the outside, and a silver-colored dome at the top. City officials borrowed money, issued bonds, raised taxes, all to meet the payments. When the building was paid off in 1910, 40 years later, the city celebrated for 2 days with the governor even attending the event. Now, you can go down to Carlinville, you can visit the building, and you will find county officials doing their work on a daily basis. Now, remember in Springfield not too long ago, a couple of years ago, there was a big hoopla about iron doors down there and all this extravagant spending. Well, it's nothing new. Okay, Dr. Green Vardaman Black, known as the father of modern dentistry, came from Jacksonville. He was born in nearby Winchester in 1836, served in the Union Army, and learned about medicine and dentistry. He presented papers before the Illinois and Missouri Dental Societies, and in 1870 was elected president of the Illinois State Dental Society. 7 years later, with his brother, he co-authored the Illinois Medical Practice Act that required physicians in the state to be licensed. He authored books, invented several dental instruments, and made over 1,000 contributions to dental medicine. He was one of the founders of the Northwestern University Dental School in 1891. Anybody go to Northwestern here? All right, okay. Became dean of the school in 1897 and died in 1915. A statue of Dr. Black, unveiled in 1918, is located in Chicago's Lincoln Park, found near Astor Street and North Avenue. So if you're in that area, look for the statue of Dr. Black. And I might mention to you that next time you go to your dentist, ask your dentist if he ever heard of Dr. Green Vardaman Black. And if he says no, I'd start looking for another dentist if I were. Okay. Now, one of the stops on US 51 is Decatur, Illinois, the birthplace of the Grand Army of the Republic in 1866, Millikan University in 1903, and the Decatur Staleys, forerunners of the Chicago Bears in the early 1920s. Now, if you mention the Salt and the SWAT to most people, they think of Babe Ruth, right? You all think of Babe Ruth, right? Well, not in Decatur, Illinois. The salt in the SWAT is Robert Montgomery, a local businessman who invented a simple device in 1900 that he called the fly killer, and we know it today as the fly swatter. So I think the fly swatter and the mousetrap are probably two of the best inventions ever in our history. Eastern Illinois, there are 10 trips in this eastern part of the state. A lot of people don't get over there to that area. They usually head straight south or to the west. I'm going to talk about two segments in Illinois 32 and Illinois 133 that include the old Amish communities of Arcola and Arthur. The first families of old Amish, the Mennonites, arrived in 1865 from Pennsylvania, and the town of Arthur was incorporated 12 years later. Most of the cottage industries around outside of town are operated by the Amish, and while the in-town business are run by the non-Amish, or English as they are called by the Amish. Transportation of the Amish is by horse and buggy. This is their means of transportation. This is not a replica town. This is how these people live and travel around. They do not own cars. You can experience the exact life that they experience by visiting their restaurants, their local grocery stores, and their cottage industries. When we go over to Arcola, which is considered the gateway to to Arthur, you'll find a historical marker here to Johnny Gruelle. He was the creator of Raggedy Ann and Andy in 1915. He was an illustrator. He died in 1938. Raggedy Ann was inducted into the National Toy Hall of Fame in 2002. And here you see, I brought along Raggedy Ann and Andy here, but you see Raggedy Ann is smiling, but she wouldn't be smiling if she knew she was manufactured in China. That's for sure. Another attraction in Arcola, and it's hard to believe, is the Hippie Memorial. It's the only monument in the country to the hippie movement. It is 60 feet long, comprised of, as you can see here, a lot of welded rods, junk pieces, metal parts, crafted metal, and other odd pieces, which represent various eras in the sculptor's life, who, by the way, was a nonconformist but not a hippie. He lived into the 60s, so you got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 eras. You go to Shelbyville on Illinois 16, is known for many things, but one of them is the first automatic dishwasher, which you see at the other end. Josephine Garris Cochran, a housewife with the help of a mechanic, invented the dishwasher device in 1886 in a woodshed behind her home. It won an award at the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago for best design and construction, and was embraced by hotels and restaurants. I guess they felt a better need for it because they have more dishes, but housewives did not embrace it. After Cochran's death in 1913, the company was sold, and in 1949 was acquired by KitchenAid and now owned by Whirlpool. Here's something. How many went to the University of Illinois? Oh, a lot of it. Okay, you remember the Morrill Plots? Okay. Well, this is a picture of the Morrill Plots as it looks today. The oldest agricultural experimental field in the United States, which was established in the 1870s. I took this photograph of the plots from the rooftop of the agriculture building, and that was prior to 9/11. I doubt if I would be able to get on top of that building today on the roof to take that same picture. Those of you who attended the school may remember walking past this open field. Originally, it was 10 1/2-acre plots established to measure crop production using crop rotation versus continuous replanting. The field still exists, as you see, is maintained by a volunteer staff from the Agriculture Department, but is reduced in size to 1 1/2 acres as a result of university expansion. After the site was designated a National Historic Landmark in 1968, all future university buildings that might compromise the integrity of the Mauroplots had to be built underground. Today, if you visit the adjacent undergraduate library, you will have to enter below grade to visit the book stacks and other service areas, which are all built underground. So here's the undergraduate library over here. No more tall buildings alongside the Mauroplots. Northern Illinois, although many historic events took place in this area, basically it's north of I-80 or US 6. There's 11 trips there, and much of them follow what the Black Hawk War of 1832. It was the last hurrah for the Indians in the state and the end of 3-month basic conflict, which settled the Indian question of their continued presence and potential threats, opening the state to future settlement. After the warrior leader Black Hawk and about 2,500 followers, including about 500 warriors, crossed the Mississippi River earlier in the year, they primarily moved up the Rock River to reclaim their native land, which Black Hawk believed had been stolen from them by the U.S. government. The Black Hawk War started in the mid-May 1832 with the Battle of Stillman's Run, located east of the Rock River on Illinois 72 near Byron. This monument, Stillman Valley, contains the graves, that's this one right here, contains the graves of 12 militiamen killed in the opening battle of the conflict. About a week later, 3 families, 15 men, women, and children, were massacred at Indian Creek, about 20 miles northeast of Ottawa, by a rogue band of Potawatomi warriors. Now, this is a depiction of what the Indian Creek massacre might have looked like. It appeared in a book in around 1870. I would say, from what I've read about Indian massacres, that probably is a pretty accurate depiction of what probably occurred. Later, there were battles during that conflict at Apple River Fort near Elizabeth and at Kellogg's Grove near Kent, all places that can be visited today. This monument near Kent, south of US 20, on your way to Galena, contains the remains of those killed at the 2 battles of Kellogg's Grove, nearby skirmishes, and also contains the remains of several dispatch riders traveling from Galena to Dixon. Here we have Joseph Glidden and barbed wire. Some people think the Winchester 73 and the Colt 45 tamed the West, but barbed wire played a big role in the settlement. Now, barbed wire was invented right here in DeKalb, Illinois, by all these people here. Patented different variations of barbed wire, but Joseph Glidden here, his home over there on Illinois 38 in DeKalb, the Lincoln Highway, he was declared the father of barbed wire. This is the barn, which is adjacent to his home. This is where he first manufactured barbed wire. And it was patented in 1874. And you can visit this home probably on one day of the year. And it just was held in early part of May. But it's inside, it's just resembles an old barn. They're trying to restore it. But right now, it's best is just to see it from the outside. Just west of DeKalb, near Malta on Illinois 38, under the existing roadway, is the first seedling mile of concrete laid as part of the country's first transcontinental highway. It was the brainchild of Carl Fisher, an Indiana car parts dealer and co-founder of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. With the support of other leaders in the automobile industry, they persevered in building a highway using existing roads and trails that connected from New York to San Francisco. Rather than simply using existing gravel and dirt, the highway's booster introduced the use of concrete in Malta and 5 other places in the country, and as you might expect, concrete soon became the preferred material to travel on instead of gravel. You might find this of interest. It was a young Lieutenant Colonel Dwight D. Eisenhower who participated in the first military convoy across the country on the Lincoln Highway in 1919, leaving Washington, D.C. and arriving in San Francisco after 62 days and covering 3,251 miles. We'll venture a little closer to home. This is in the Collar counties. 9 trips here will take you to different interesting places, all within a short driving distance. How many believe that John Deere invented the steel plow? Anybody? A couple, huh? There's a couple of you. Come on, you raise your hand if you, okay? Well, I'm going to show you you're wrong. So those of you who had hidden thoughts, you didn't want to raise your hand, that's all right. You're going to gain some knowledge. John Deere did not invent the steel plow. Contrary to popular belief and what you were taught in grade school, a few years ago, John Lane of Will County invented the steel plow. This is John Lane here. This is his invention over here. I know it's kind of hard to see. And this is a model of John Deere's plow. Lane arrived in Illinois from New Hampshire in 1834 and settled in Will County. As a farmer and a blacksmith, he soon saw the problem local farmers had with wooden mold boards cutting through the thick Illinois vegetation. He invented a plow using a broken saw blade as a mold board. His sole purpose was to help local farmers, and he did not patent the invention. Oh, his son later established a factory and did compete with John Deere. John Deere's role is similar. He settled in Grand Detour from Vermont in 1836. Grand Detour is on the Rock River. Helped local farmers and manufactured a plow using broken saw blades to cut through the soil, just as Lane did. The difference is that Deere patented his invention in 1837. And started manufacturing plows in Grand Detour. He moved to Moline in 1848, died in 1886. So to Lane goes the invention, and to Deere goes the patent. And that's the way it is. And the John Deere Corporation today admits that John Lane did invent the steel plow. Here in Batavia, Illinois, just off Illinois 31, about 40 miles from west of Chicago, is the former Bellevue Place, a sanitarium for disturbed women. In 1875, Mary Todd Lincoln was confined there for 3 months by court order, although she had a fair amount of liberty dining with friends and taking carriage rides. This is the original building here where Mary Todd Lincoln stayed. These 2 wings were added in 1885. The rooms were converted to apartments in 1986. There's condominiums on the grounds now in the back. But the furniture used in a room is now displayed, much as it was arranged in a room at the Batavia Depot Museum over here. This is all her original furniture from her room. Now we're even getting closer here. Just off I-94 in Glenview, just a short distance from here, is Kennecott Grove, the former home of Dr. John Kennecott. But it is his son, Robert, who is better known in the Chicago area. Robert became interested in science at a young age, and in 1856 helped found the Academy of Natural Sciences, now the Chicago Academy of Sciences. He was a prolific writer about insects and plants in Illinois, and did the same in his explorations to Alaska. He died on an expedition to Alaska in 1866, but his reports to the Smithsonian Institution helped to convince the United States government to purchase Alaska from the Russians. The deal was done in 1867 for 2 cents an acre. Okay, pretty good deal, huh? Okay, neighborhood, Chicago. This trip contains there's 11 trips in Chicago region, including North and South Lakeshore Drive, all expressway corridors and other arterial streets that meander through neighborhoods and community areas. John Baptiste Point de Sable. On the North Michigan Avenue trip that includes Pioneer Court, we identified a site of the cabin of Chicago's first non-native permanent settler, John Baptiste Point de Sable. He remained here from approximately 1779 to 1800. His cabin was later occupied by John Kinsey and in 1831 by Mark Noble Sr., who you'll learn a little bit about in a little bit. I might point out in Chicago, there is some confusion about DeSable's last name. According to John Swenson over here, seated in the audience, right in the front, a contributing editor to the book Early Chicago and an authority, I might add, on early Chicago history, he wrote, Point DeSable was his chosen legal name. He was never called DuSable during his lifetime. The fictitious surname DuSable imposed on Jean-Baptiste appeared only long after his death in 1818. Du is a corruption of the proper French pronunciation of day, which Anglophones write as du. So in Chicago, the DuSable Museum of African History, the DuSable Bridge on Michigan Avenue, and the U.S. postage stamp that honors DuSable are wrong in their spelling, according to John Swenson. And I agree. I am only pointing this out in the interest of keeping history correct. I also learned that when John speaks, we should all listen, at least, when it comes to early Chicago history. Here is the, on Wacker Drive Roosevelt Road trip along South Michigan Avenue, which includes the historic South Michigan Boulevard District. We will pass the former Santa Fe building, now the Motorola building, and atop the roof to the right of the letter A in Motorola, you will see a small enclosed office shown here. This is where Daniel Burnham and Edward Bennett created the plan of Chicago in 1909. These views gave Burnham and Bennett a panorama of the lakefront at the time. Of course, the park and tall buildings were absent when the plan was unveiled here. The best view of the penthouse, which has since been converted to a conference room, is from Lakeshore Drive to the easternmost part, or the easternmost part of Grant Park. So you cannot see this penthouse if you're down on Michigan Avenue. You got to go all the way over to along the lakefront and look over to the streetscape, and you can see the penthouse atop the building. So in 1909, all these high rises, these were railroad yards down here. The high rises were gone. The Art Institute, I don't even think, no, that was there. Part of that building was there. But the railroad yards were back in there. And to the east, all those other buildings were not there. So they had a beautiful view in which to create their plan of Chicago. Then we go to the far northwest side of the city. On the I-90 trip from Montrose Avenue to O'Hare Airport, this is in my neighborhood, is the quaint community of Norwood Park, which is, part of it is now on the National Register of Historic Places. In this community, incorporated as a village in 1874 and annexed to Chicago in 1893, is the oldest house in Chicago. Now, I know a lot of you might think the Widow Clark House is the oldest house in Chicago, and there's some dispute about it. But the Clark House was built in 1836. This was built in 1833, the Noble Seymour Crippen House. The south wing, which is the original building, it still stands on its original foundation, was built, like I said, in 1833. That's this part right here. And by Mark Noble Sr., who was the last occupant of Jean-Baptiste Point DeSable's cabin on the Chicago River. Noble died in 1839, and other families occupied the original house. But in 1868, the home was purchased by Thomas Seymour, a trader who added the north wing for his enlarged family. That's all of this over here. In 1916, Stuart Crippen and his family purchased the home, selling it in 1987 to the Norwood Park Historical Society. The following year, it was declared a Chicago landmark. The Chicago flag, seen so often by all of us, was designed by Wallace Rice and adopted in 1917. Its first two stars represent the Great Chicago Fire and the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition. Century of Progress star was added in 1933, and the star to commemorate the Battle of Fort Dearborn, which earlier was known as the Fort Dearborn Massacre, but is no longer politically correct, was added in 1939. No additional star has been added in the past 75 years, meaning no event has equaled the importance of any of the previous four. That's my view. The state of Illinois flag was adopted in 1915 and altered to include the state's name in 1970 at the request of a Vietnam War veteran who was serving in the Asian conflict. And so ends my abbreviated roadside history of Illinois. I hope that this brief introduction, not finished.
We have time for some questions.
Okay, wait, I'm not finished. I hope that this brief introduction will entice you to read and study about the people, places, and events that made history happen in our state. And for those of you who are more inclined to take additional trips, you might want to follow some of the scenic byways, primarily along the famous waterways or the most historic highways, or take the Ronald Reagan Heritage Trail through the towns in which the family lived. After all, he is our only native-born resident. Despite our state's reputation for corruption, fiscal mismanagement, short-sightedness, and often coming up last in achievement categories, Illinois still has a wondrous story, and I'm proud to say that I'm from Illinois, and I hope you are too. Originally, one of my goals was to disprove the ubiquitous presence of Abraham Lincoln. I soon saw that that was impossible and concluded, as I said in the beginning, there is much more to Illinois than Abraham Lincoln. I now encourage you to venture forth and see Illinois. It is waiting for you to discover and understand its past. Thank you very much, and now I'll take a few questions because of the time limit.
Thank you, Tex.
You excluded Frank Lloyd Wright. Why?
Not on purpose. Frank Lloyd Wright I could not include in my talk. You see it already included. Frank Lloyd Wright is mentioned in the book. He has two homes that were designed that rest together down in Kankakee, the only place in the country. They exist like that. He has a home in Riverside that he's designed, a lot of homes in Oak Park. Wait. Oh. And so he's in the book, but he's not included in my talk. I could not include everything in my talk. So I apologize if I've offended you with Frank Lloyd Wright. Yes?
I know you have a lot of different short trips you could recommend, but if we only had time for one trip, what would be your first recommendation from this area? Where should we go?
Oh, boy. That would depend on how far you want to travel.
All right, how about your top three?
I would say the most beautiful trip would be along the Rock River, up near Oregon, Illinois, along Illinois 2. Well, beautiful, just beautiful. Just keep your eye on the road, okay? The statue that overlooks, the Indian statue that overlooks the Rock River is not it's often called incorrectly the Black Hawk statue. That is a misnomer. The correct title is The Eternal Indian by Laredo Taft. But a lot of people call it the Black Hawk statue because it overlooks the beautiful country that he considered so valuable to him. Okay.
Where did the name Illinois come from?
Pardon?
Where did the name Illinois?
Illinois Indians. They were a part of a Algonquian tribe. There were a group of them, probably maybe about 5 or 6 different tribes. Kankakee were one of them, the Michigamea, the Miami. No, Miami wasn't. What were the other ones? But anyway, it was part of the, it was a Illinois Confederation, Illinois Confederation.
Tex,
Okay.
Tell us a little bit about your process of going to these places and writing your book. You know, what inspired you and how do you do it? Obviously, you drive, right? Do you go alone?
Right,
do you do?
right,
tell us a little bit about the process
Oh my gosh. I first started out, there's a volume called Historical Markers and Monuments in Illinois. Many, maybe 200 pages or so, and I started thumbing through it and looking for areas of interest. As you look and find things of interest, what you think of interest, and now as you go through the book, as you develop the process, the writing process, the research process, you find that some are not as important as others. They fall by the wayside. Some of those that became important had to be pushed aside as well because there's a limit. This book is 496 pages. I did not go to all the places, unfortunately. I'm trying to do that now as I go around the state. History in Illinois, any place, has to be seen. It has to be felt. It has to be experienced. I can give you all the books you want. I've been to the Little Bighorn Battlefield in Montana, and you read about the Custer's troop movements and the movement of the Indians and so forth, and the time of day and all those things. Unless you are out at that site, approximately around that time of the day or that time period, or walk the miles that they had to cover in that time, or see the distances or the rolling terrain, you will not feel what they felt, right? But that's what you have to do. You have to get out there. You have to feel the history. Really. Okay?
Thank you very much. Give them applause. All right, here you go.